Good day and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. So far, we have surrounded Bytown with loyalist settlements up and down the Ottawa and Rideau rivers, in the form of Wrightstown, Hawkesbury, Perth, and others. We've introduced some of the major players in Philman Wright, John By, and John Mackay. We've painted a world of the British colonies in North America for Bytown to be situated in, and we've given jobs to the people there, working for the Rideau Canal, the lumber industry, and the military. Today, we're going to explore the town in its first decade of existence. I've been describing it as a labor camp, and I hope that hasn't given the impression of a ramshackle campground. A labor camp, especially one overseen by the military, was an orderly structure inhabited by disorderly people. To walk from the west end of the city, at Richmond Landing, to where Rideau Street crosses its namesake river, is about 4 kilometers and would take about an hour to walk. In 1832, the population reached 1,000 souls, which means that I've lived in an apartment building with more people. Population density and crowding have never really been an issue for Ottawa, though to be fair, it matters how those people are spread out. 1,000 people in my city is not crowded. 1,000 people in my living room is a nightmare. Bytown had a lot of space, but there were some places that seemed very crowded when you got there. Something that's always been an issue for Ottawa is water. With several lakes, rivers, and canals within the city limits in 1832, as today, observing drainage, sewage, and flooding have always concerned the residents and the administrators. When I moved to London, England, to pursue my PhD, I was told about how bad the weather there was. London is famous for its precipitation. On average, the notoriously wet city gets about 650 millimeters a year. Ottawa gets 750 millimeters of rain alone, so about 10% more rain, and that's just rain. If you include snowfall in precipitation, it's close to 30% more. Ottawa is a water-attuned city, and its history and structure reflects this. With that being said, we'll start our tour on the water at the north end of the Union Bridge, connecting Upper and Lower Canada over the Chaudière Falls, crossing from Hull Township and the town of Wrightstown. The Ottawa River is a broad one, measuring about 600 meters at the Chaudière crossing, and it's the narrowest point in the immediate area, and it's dotted with islands, making it a good spot for a bridge, even if the waterfall makes it a dangerous one. The islands make for a hopping strategy to make small bridges from one islet to the next, rather than a single giant bridge, and that's why the connection was built so quickly. The first arc of the bridge, going from the Lower Canada side to the first island, was a stone arc bridge, quarried by Philman Wright and Sons, near what's now the Robert Gurtin Arena. The plan was decided upon on 26 September 1826, and the first stone arch was completed on 30 October, after slightly more than a month. Unfortunately, to quote Mr. W.B. Yeats, the center could not hold. It sagged in the middle, it drooped, and it had to be started again in November. There's a joke about Ottawa that there are 2 seasons, winter and construction. And that's because you can't use mortar and cement in the winter, when it's too cold for binding agents to dry. So rather than wait for spring, the second draft of the first arc was made without mortar. Curiously, it held, and it stands to this day. Because it was the first arc, it's called Arc Number 3. This brought the bridge to the first island, and since the second island was closer than the second arc was built in the same manner, bringing Union Bridge halfway across the Ottawa. The remaining stretch would need 2 cantilever bridges to complete the stretch over the broader part of the Ottawa. In civil engineering, a cantilever bridge is when you start building out of one side, eventually meeting another cantilever construction extending out from the other bank. There is then a central support once the 2 ends meet. They look unsafe while being built, but are common for building long bridges. The Union Bridge was relatively unsafe because 2 people died during its construction. But occupational health and safety was not prioritized as much back then. A cantilever bridge in dentistry is a false tooth attached on one side. The full bridge was finished in the summer of 1827, 9 months after it was decided upon by John By and his team. We could now walk 650 meters from Wrightstown in Lower Canada across the river to Richmond Landing in Upper Canada. Richmond Landing was a dock for boats heading from Montreal to Richmond Town. Rather than turning right and going to Richmond, we were going to turn left on the Richmond Road and head towards Bytown. Staying on the road, we start in the middle of the allotment belonging to John Le Breton, though we're not trespassing because of the right-of-way on this military road that would be used mostly for bringing materials from Wrightstown to Bytown. The road is unpredictable in spring because it runs over the Great Dow Swamp, a long lowland swamp that extends from what's now Dow's Lake down Preston Street to the Ottawa River. We emerge from Le Breton's swampy forest to find the inhabited settlement of Upper Bytown. Richmond Road, now rechristened Wellington after the hero of Waterloo and patron of the current Governor-General Dalhousie. North of Wellington is the settlement with roads, houses, and businesses, whereas south of the settlement was another forested swamp that one of Philemon Wright's former employees, Nicholas Sparks, had purchased and was trying to convert into farmland. He couldn't, but would eventually sell it to the Ordnance Board to include in the settlement and make up a tidy profit. The first building to be seen would be the first stone building in all of Bytown, St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. The current St. Andrew's, at the same place, is the 1873 renovation, but this building was credited to Thomas Mackay on the land that was donated by Sparks. In 1929, the grounds next to it would host the town's first fair. It would be the centre for Scottish culture, along with Mackay's Scottish colony of New Edinburgh, way up on the other side of town. On the left side of the road, Upper Bytown would stretch from the river to Wellington, and then from Bay Street to the area that's now Bank Street. So the National Library and Archives, which are slated to move into Le Breton Flats, the Supreme Court, the Justice Building, and Confederation Block were all residential housing at this point. In October of 26, when the bridges were being built, the owner of the land of Upper Bytown, our friend, the Earl of Dalhousie, put the land up for private ownership to anyone who could build a home in the next 12 months. 38 applied, including Thomas Mackay and our friend Dr. Christie, both part of the initial canal project. Only 2 other people managed to build homes in this giveaway, but others would eventually populate the neighborhood. There were 3 east-west streets, Wellington in the south, Rear Street backing the cliff, and Victoria Street betwixt them. Kent and Bank Street pierced them, and the subdivisions became homes, businesses, and hotels. This was the genteel part of Bytown. As we walked past the well-mannered quarter, we entered into the military district. Long before Parliament Hill hosted Parliament, it hosted a barracks, and was hence named Barracks Hill. Adjectives in English are typically singular, so it should have been called Barrack Hill, but, again, nobody lets me name things. The barracks were built on Lot D, which was a part of Dalhousie's purchase of land. They would host some of the earliest buildings there, built by Mackay and Redpath as part of their expansive contract with the canal project. In June of 27, the 15th Company of Sappers arrived to take residence, and were followed by the 7th Company in September. Later that year, a hospital would be constructed on the hill alongside the barracks. The following summer, the hospital would be open to all when swamp fever, a form of malaria, struck the settlement, and again in 32, when Asiatic cholera had an outbreak. Death stalked this community with such rapacity that the first civilian cemetery was built between Sparks, Queen, Elgin, and Metcalfe Streets. Sappers would handle much of the demolition and fortification construction along the canal. For example, they built a bridge over the canal, extending the walk along Wellington, and renaming it a 3rd time, this time to call it Rideau Street, as it would lead from the barracks to the Rideau River. The bridge, creatively named Sappers Bridge, would remain standing until 1912. From Sapper's Bridge, not a top Sapper's Bridge, it was a level bridge, not an arced one, you could look south and see the canal extend through Sparks Land, onward towards that of Billings and Dow. Cranberry Lake, what has since been drained and become the Golden Triangle, was described by John McTaggart, nominee for Ottawa's first tourism spokesman, as a dank slime having the blue mist over its surface and giving off a nauseous smell, like that of a cadaverous animal in the last stages of decomposition. Northward, you could see the locks that brought the canal gradually down to the level of the Ottawa River at what was now called Entrance Bay. Prior to being named Entrance Bay, it was called Sleigh Bay. That's sleigh as in what Santa drives, not as what the kids today say to announce an act done with confidence and success. Sleigh Bay was named after the winter wedding of Tiberius Wright, Philemon's son, who couldn't find a justice of the peace to perform his marriage in Lower Canada, but found one in Upper Canada. So the wedding party loaded into sleighs, crossed onto the sheltered bay to host the wedding by the local JP. In August of 27, famed Arctic explorer Sir John Franklin laid the first stones of the locks, and a month later Dalhousie would lay the cornerstone of the third lock. On the right, or eastern side of the canal, was Colonel's Hill, named after Colonel John By, whose home sat atop it, in what's now called Major's Hill. The hill was officially demoted in 1832, when Major Daniel Bolton took over from the publicly dishonored By as superintending engineer of the Rideau Canal. Crossing Sapper's Bridge, Wellington Street flowed into Rideau Street. This marks our entrance into Lowertown, where the hoi polloi find themselves dwelling. Standing at the corner of Rideau Street and Sussex, there is no Chateau Laurier, Rideau Centre, or train station, just two dirt roads. Rideau heading east to the river, and Sussex heading north, eventually to cross the same river at Rideau Falls. Lot B would become the heart of Lowertown. It stretched along Rideau Street from the canal to the Rideau River and north to Murray Street. Settlement of canal workers would be between these streets, with George and York Streets where they are now, and they would be boxed in by Sussex and King Street, now King Edward Avenue. This would be the original Lowertown. At the corner of George and Sussex, Lowertown's first hotel, the British, was founded in 1827. And with many modifications and renovations, the building is still there, although there are now several different businesses operating within, none of which are a hotel. North of Murray would be Lot A, from the Rideau River to the canal between Murray and Highway A5, connecting King Edward to the Macdonald-Cartier Bridge. Lot A would eventually join Bytown in 42, and past the highway until Rideau Falls would be sold to Thomas Mackay in 29, to eventually become Bytown's first Scottish suburb across the river. 1832 saw the construction of the first Roman Catholic church at the corner of Sussex and St. Patrick. It was a small wooden building for the large Catholic population, but that was a sign that the community was settling, and this was in the year that construction on the canal came to an end. So, the continuing presence of the inhabitants was in question. The site of the church is now the site of Notre Dame Basilica, though that grand building would not begin construction until 1846. The religious unity between the French and Irish Catholics of Lowertown would be a hypothetical alliance, as the violence between the populations continued to rise throughout the 1830s, until the viciousness between them turned Bytown into one of the most dangerous municipalities in the Americas. The Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada refused to send militias to assist with preserving order, and it would be another 30 years until the local police force was established. The residents of Bytown welcomed the fact that there were a large barracks and garrison that sat adjacent to the only bridge connecting Upper Bytown to Lowertown. Even if you ignore the poverty and violence, Lowertown was not as nice as Upper Bytown. One of the major reasons for this was that there were more families in Uppertown, making it a community, whereas Lowertown had a much higher percentage of single men doing what single men do, But that was not the only reason for the disparity, although class behaviors were certainly a consideration as well. Prior to 1844, Lot A was property of the Board of Ordnance. The people who lived there were either renters or squatters. In Upper Bytown, members of a certain class were literally gifted land for free if they chose to occupy it. In Lot A, there were shanties and cabins to be built, as everyone needed a roof, but it was not land ownership, but was instead viewed as adequate custodianship. A community would develop there, but more slowly than it would in Uppertown, as the Lowertowners were less settled and more seasonal. Northwest of Lowertown was New Edinburgh, the gradual building of which was largely a pet project of Thomas Mackay, building a little Scotland in Upper Canada, and recruiting settlers from his Highland home. Southwest along Rideau Street, past the settlement limit, was a territory given for church development, and Bytown's first purpose-built house of worship was built at what's now called Chapel Street. It was a Methodist church. Nearby was the first school, the English Mercantile and Mathematical Academy. Just across the Rideau River, a small settlement was established in 1830 as Janeville, the future Vanier, a second suburb, to compete with New Edinburgh upriver. This was settled by inhabitants of Lowertown and sought to escape the crowds and squalor. As I'd said at the beginning, Bytown, Upper and Lower, had a combined population of about 1,000. The fact that this small a number allowed for crowding and squalor was because of the failure of any serious attempt at community building. Bytown was thought of as a temporary labor camp, not a future city, and the roads, buildings, and infrastructure reflected this underlying belief. In our stroll here through Bytown, we've seen 5 communities developing. We started with Wrightstown, settled by Americans, not loyalists, but Americans who came seeking cheap land in Lower Canada. The next community was Upper Bytown, which was largely what we would call middle-class, Protestant, propertied community with connections to the administration. The third community was Lowertown, a mostly working-class, Hiberno-Gallic, Roman Catholic community of sojourners. New Edinburgh, a refuge of Clan Mackay, populated by transplanted Caledonians, and a middling community seeking relief from the congestion of Lowertown in Janeville. This is not a city. It's not even really a town. It's 5 communities that share a geography and economy, but the skeletal structures of a city are beginning to coalesce. On 25 November 1826, Colonel Bye's assistant overseer of works, Thomas Burroughs, became a father for the first white baby born in Bytown. John Bye Burroughs, named after his father's boss, died the following June, making him the first person to live his whole life in Bytown. Also the first European person to be buried in Sandy Hill. A local history was beginning. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ottawa History Hub podcast. Next week, we're going to explore the religious mosaic of this emerging community. In the meantime, if you'd like to contact me, the best way is at ottawahistoryhub@gmail.com, or you can leave a message on the Contact Me page on the website at ottawahistoryhub.com. You can follow me on Facebook and Blue Sky as Ottawa History Hub, or X-Twitter at @OttHistoryHub. As always, this podcast is written, recorded, and produced by myself, Brendan Ray. Please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast on whatever podcatcher you use, and leave us a 5-star review if you feel so inclined. Take care, and until next time, advance Ottawa, en avant!